why are we going 6,000 miles away to another part of the world? Well, why is our army 6,000 miles away in another part of the world? People in the other part of the world are asking the same question. Why is your army 6,000 miles away from home in our country? Back here, we're asking, don't you require a declaration of war to do that? How do you enter another country with your military and build military bases and conduct military operations in another country with no congressional authority or constitutional authority from your own country, no international mandate of any kind, no request or invitation from the country that you've invaded? This is what we've come to.
And our next speaker is going to be John Peters. John's very knowledgeable on the situation in the Middle East, particularly the Levant, and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and that area. And he's going to share some information on the current situation there, and as well as taking questions as to what's going on now and what the ramifications are and things that we might want to be thinking about. John, come on down and speak to the group, please.
Appreciate that. So then as I was sitting there thinking, I'm thinking, okay, now I'm going to take everybody 6,000 miles away from the Garage Mahal to the Middle East. Why? We just had an election here. Now we're going to talk about something going on in another part of the world. Isn't this more important? And then, the more I thought about it, I thought what everybody needs to understand is the connection between these two events, okay? So why are we going 6,000 miles away to another part of the world? Well, why is our army 6,000 miles away in another part of the world? People in the other part of the world are asking the same question. Why is your army 6,000 miles away from home in our country? Back here, we're asking, don't you require a declaration of war to do that? How do you enter another country with your military and build military bases and conduct military operations in another country with no congressional authority or constitutional authority from your own country, no international mandate of any kind, no request or invitation from the country that you've invaded? This is what we've come to. And I think of it in terms of our Constitution. Where do we need to refocus? And I think this is one of the biggest areas. It's not something that happened overnight. It's not something that happened with the latest election or even the last 3 elections. But we've had this progression of what I call the imperial presidency, where the Congress has essentially abandoned its constitutional obligations where the war powers are concerned and deferred to the executive. And the executive now sees himself as unchecked, whoever it is, to commit American forces wherever they see fit to connect them or to commit them. So the situation I came to talk about was Syria because it's kind of first and foremost in kind of the hottest fire that's going on right now and has been now going on for 8 years. It's been commonly portrayed as a civil war, but largely discredited in the years since. People have come to understand that what's really going on is that the U.S. government and its allies want the current government in Syria gone, so that they can install a government that's more friendly and a little more malleable and more compliant with what we'd like to see happen. So we come, interestingly, under the guise of democracy, not only to Syria, but to a lot of these countries. That's always our platform, is we're trying to support democracy in these countries. Well, I don't know how it's democracy when you use military force to install a government. That's kind of counter-democracy to me. What's been going on since last time I was in front of Campaign for Liberty? Well, in broader terms, the situation in Syria is improving for the people in Syria. The war that we tried to prosecute there by proxy, because we realized we really didn't have legal authority to enter the country militarily and overthrow a government in a country that never attacked us, never declared war on us, never threatened us. That would just be too obvious. So we tried to do it by proxy. And the first attempt to do it by proxy was to recruit the Syrians themselves, who were at odds with their government. And like any government anywhere else, including our government here, there's opposition in Syria. There's political opposition and there's more hardcore opposition. But what we quickly found out is that it never rose to a level sufficient to overcome the overwhelming support that that government had. So these guys are going to need a little help. So we started bringing in mercenary soldiers, for lack of a better term, financed by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, recruited from 85, 90 different countries around the world. They came from China, they came from Central Asia, they came from North Africa, all under the banner of this is a holy war, we're going to establish an Islamic caliphate in Syria. It was a popular motivation for these people, who were easy to recruit. They were paid handsomely for it. And we supplied weapons, we supplied intelligence, we supplied training. And yet, all of that was not enough to overcome the domestic opposition to what we were trying to do. Not domestic opposition to their own government, but people quickly coalesced around their government and their military, and they fought this for 8 years, and quite successfully, really despite incredible odds. Because before this war even started in 2010, the country was under 3 years of sanctions, which is another one of our popular tools that we use for people we don't like, is we're going to starve you or cut you off from these things, and you can't have this, and we're going to not let you trade in the international monetary system. And it's a way of trying to break them down before you get to the point of military force. If that doesn't work, the next step is military force. So Syria had sanctions going back to 2007. They're still in place now. And yet, somehow, the country was able to sustain and was able to work its way through. Now, most of the major population centers in the country, which are primarily on the Mediterranean side of the country or the western side of the country, Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, where else? Not Deir ez-Zor, but Dara. These places have all been liberated, and now they're currently under reconstruction. You see, if you get information from Syria now, you'll see the people, there's a large return of people who left because of the fighting. They're now been returning in the hundreds of thousands to their areas. These areas are being rebuilt. These terrorist armies that used to occupy the areas have been liquidated and they're out. And what's really happened is it's been reduced to 2 pockets now. And the interesting thing is the 2 pockets in Syria where these terrorist groups remain are the 2 areas occupied by the American military. That's interesting. They don't exist anywhere outside of those areas. I don't want to say we're supporting them. I don't want to say we're protecting them. But yeah, we are. So you have an area up in the north that maybe you've read about in the news. You've seen reference to an area called Idlib. Idlib's up on the northern border of Syria. It's a province in the north. It borders on Turkey. And there are many, many parties that have converged in Idlib now. The Turks have a military presence there. The Americans are involved there. These groups, in any number of them, have all centered in Idlib. The Kurds and they call the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is really made up primarily of the Kurds, all have come together in this one area of Syria. Now, it's interesting how that happened. One of the programs that Syria employed to end the conflict is they had a policy. When they were fighting these groups in the major urban areas, they would offer them an amnesty if they were Syrian citizens. If you lay down your weapons, if you come, go back to your lives, and promise not to commit any more violence and destruction, you can be repatriated, we'll take you back, you can go back to your lives. And they, of course, they vetted people too to make sure they weren't guilty of any major crimes. As to the foreign fighters, which was probably 80 to 90% of these rebel forces, as they call them, that was not available. But was made available to them, we call it the green bus ride. They were told, you can take small arms, no heavy weapons, and you and your families can get on these buses and you can go to Idlib province. we'll let you live. You can go and reside in Idlib. Initially, that was extremely unpopular with the people in Syria because their attitude was, we're just going to be fighting this in a different location. Just finish it now where they are. But the government was a little more farsighted, and actually the policy, people are now seeing the wisdom of it. It preserved a lot of the remaining infrastructure because there weren't battles in these major urban areas to wipe out the remainder of them. It saved a lot of lives, both in terms of the military, but also in terms of civilian life, and preserved a lot of infrastructure. And a lot of these guys took advantage of it when they realized they had no other option. They were up against it. They got on these buses. They all went up to Idlib. So now you have thousands of these fighters up in Idlib. There's been a lot of internal fighting, as you might imagine, among them, like putting rats in a cage. Eventually, they're going to start feeding on each other. So there's power battles. It would be like, probably like if you took our urban street gangs and put them all in a 2-block area, they're going to fight for turf and everything else. So that's been going on. And you have all these other outside parties who have an interest in the outcome of the battle in Idlib. So right now, there's very heavy negotiations going on between the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Kurds, as to how they're going to work their way out of Idlib without there being a ground invasion. The Americans have told the Syrians, you cannot conduct a ground invasion in Idlib. If you do, we're going to attack you. It's an interesting concept that a national army cannot go into an area of its country and liberate its own country under threat of an attack by another country, a foreign country that's illegally in their country. It's an interesting concept. Anyway, but by and large, the news is good. And the situation's contained to Idlib, and then in the south, there's an area called Al-Tanf. And Al-Tanf is this point where Jordan, Iraq, and Syria all converge at this one point, their borders. And the Americans have built a base there. But really, there's not a lot for the Americans to do. I mean, they're kind of sitting there. So what's their end game? What do we really want? Well, about maybe 3 months ago, there was a delegation of American generals and intelligence officials who made their way secretly to Damascus, but not so secretly because everybody in Damascus knew about it, and met with their counterparts in the Syrian government. And they laid down a set of conditions. And they said, we will leave your country completely on the following terms and conditions. Number one, all the Iranians, forces or advisors in your country, leave the country. Number two, we get 10% of the oil revenues for any oil developed in the eastern part of Syria. Number three, we want intelligence information on all these terrorist groups remaining in Syria. And there was a fourth and fifth condition, which were equally ludicrous to the government. And the Syrian government basically told them, like, what is your legitimacy for making these demands other than putting a gun to somebody's head? And they basically told them politely, no thanks. And the Americans went back, and the Americans are parked in these two areas of Syria doing largely nothing. So that's very interesting. Then there's the European element. So the EU came out the other day and announced, we're not providing any reconstruction assistance to Syria until the current government steps down. That's interesting, because the people in Syria are like, we don't remember asking you to provide any assistance, but we would be happy if you just stopped destroying the country. How about you do that and leave, and you can keep the assistance? What's really interesting is at the same time these governments are condemning the government in Syria, their intelligence chiefs from these European countries have been regularly coming to Damascus to meet with Syrian intelligence, because their fear now is, now that these forces have been defeated, these guys are returning, and this is where it all affects the people in the West, including us. These guys are packing their bags and they're going back, and a lot of them came from the West. They came from European countries. They came from this country to go and fight there. They've been radicalized there, trained there, they fought there. Now the gig's up there, they're heading back home. In fact, I read the other day where was this? Canada. There's a woman who left Canada joined ISIS in Syria, fought with ISIS. She had 4 children there, and now she's demanding that the Canadian government repatriate her to Canada and support her and her 4 kids when she comes back. It's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. Of course, the people in Canada are horrified. They're like, how could you even think about that? But apparently Trudeau's thinking about it. So we've created this incredible mess, which is kind of holistically linked to what's going on here, because we've lost control of our government. That's really what's happened. I mean, I talk to people in Syria all the time. I heard from a bunch of them this morning about the elections last night, and they're like, what does it mean? This and that. And they don't get it. They're like, don't you have control over this government? And I tell them, quite honestly, no. I don't think we do have control over this government. We lost it a long time ago, especially where foreign policy is concerned. You have, in my view, the thing that Washington warned us against is now unfolding. First of all, foreign influence on our government. You have these foreign lobbyists, especially with a lot of money, the Saudis, the Turks, the Israelis. They pour a lot of money into these politicians. And through it, what they gain is they gain the control of our foreign policy and, more importantly, our military. You don't see them trying to corrupt the officials in Canada. Why? Because Canada doesn't have a military that can help them. But we do. We have a military that can change facts anywhere in the world, okay? So what was Washington's other warning? He warned against a large standing army, correct? So now we got the large standing army. He warned against foreign influence. Now we've got the foreign influence in our national government. And what's the combination of it? The combination of it is those who influenced our politicians and who own our politicians on a national level are able to convince them to support policies that carry out the agendas of these foreign governments. The war in Syria is primarily being driven by Saudi Arabia. But even more interesting is it serves the objectives of Israel, and now you have the convergence of what we call strange bedfellows. It's now out in the open that Israel and Saudi Arabia are working hand in hand on that campaign against Syria. I mean, the Syrians have known it for a long time, but it's out publicly now. You can read it anywhere. Netanyahu came out the other day and cautioned the American government and said, look, I know that the Saudis killed, Khashoggi and butchered him, and they came up with 5 different versions of what happened in this embassy, but they should be given a pass because they're working with us in the region on some things, and we think you ought to just ignore it. This is the point we've arrived at. Now, how does it affect us as average people? Well, it affects us in many ways. When our executive imposes these sanctions or boycotts on other countries, those are American companies can't do trade with these countries. That's a country where American companies could have been in there doing reconstruction and getting in on these contracts and helping to modernize the country. I'm saying without the war, they could have had these contracts. They're never going to get in on them now, having destroyed the country, unless they just take the whole country over. So American businesses suffer, employees of those businesses suffer, we lose commercial opportunities. We have a refugee problem, okay? You go to these places and people, what are we saying in the West? We got to stop this flood of refugees. Okay, here's a good way to stop it. Stop blowing up their countries where they live, then they don't have to be refugees. There were no refugees leaving Syria before 2010, okay? It all started with the war, and people will flee any war-torn country to get to safety, okay? They've got to live. So we've created that problem, and with it, yes, they're filtering terrorists through this refugee wave. They're not all terrorists, but they're using that. The terrorists are smart. They use it as a way to infiltrate terrorists into these Western countries. And now you're dealing with the outcome of that. You've got problems in the region. If we're worried about it on a geopolitical basis, we're competing with the Russians. Well, you couldn't have done a worse thing to open the door for the Russians than what you did. Because now the Russians have total influence there, because these people have to have support from some major power to offset the effect of you. So now you just opened the door to, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Russians, but I'm saying from our viewpoint, we claim there is. Well, then why did you open the door to them with a policy this stupid? So there are many, many things that come out of it that hurt us as Americans. It's bad enough that we're doing this to another group of people who did nothing to deserve it and who have undergone immense suffering. The numbers of hundreds of thousands of people killed is not an exaggeration. There have been hundreds of thousands killed. There have been probably a couple of million people in terms of refugees. There's probably more than that if you count internally displaced and externally displaced. Somebody's got to take care of them. Other countries now, their citizens are having to pony up money to take care of these refugees that we created. So when we think of it, sometimes I think we look at it as compartmentalized. Well, that's Syria, and I got to worry about, what I'm doing here. What I think I want us to understand is that connection and the need for us to take control of the government for the reasons David mentioned, and for these very real reasons about restoring constitutional authority and not having an executive that can simply commit us militarily anywhere in the globe at any time without any oversight. I'm interested in just taking questions more than blabbing on about it. So if anybody has any particular questions about what's going on over there or our policy or anything, I'm open. Yes, sir.
What exactly started the conflict in Syria?
Well, the people in Syria will tell you that they suspected from the beginning that it was instigated. It was not homegrown. There were some political differences and there were protests, but the government was actually very cautious at the beginning to make sure that nobody got hurt. They sort of did what our police did in Baltimore, where they pulled back and they said, just let them protest. We don't want to be seen as coming down on the protesters that'll work against us. They were very sensitive to the image of what was going on there in the West. So the government basically took a hands-off policy, tried to contain it. But from the very beginning, the plan was to provoke violence. And although there were legitimate, peaceful protesters at the beginning, and not a lot, frankly, you're talking about a country of 24 million, I think probably the largest demonstration they ever had was about 200,000 people, not in one place, but in the whole country in one day. The parties that were going to instigate conflict sent armed people among the protesters and shootings. They started shooting government officials, soldiers, police. The government responded, and then you had the dynamic at work. Now it's, oh, look, the government's trying to suppress the protest. And what happened is the domestic protesters, who were peaceful, withdrew. They didn't want, that wasn't their program. They weren't out there to be engaged in a conflict, a violent conflict. They were just political protesters. So when they withdrew, all that was left were those that wanted to fight, that wanted it to be an armed conflict. And they did everything they could to provoke the government. The government responded. It's the government's obligation to secure. We wouldn't allow it to happen here. But we were able to use that as an argument. You see how that works? It's like, oh, see, this government's suppressing freedom of political speech or freedom of demonstration or whatever it is with violence. They're not allowing any dissent. And if you talk to the people in Syria, they didn't even understand where it came from, because they're like, life was good. They weren't having problems in Syria. The economy was good. The country was very safe. They weren't in a war footing anywhere. It was peaceful. Everything was really quite good at the time. And that's what really got people thinking. They're like, wait a minute, why is this happening now all of a sudden? And who's really behind it? I can tell you this, at the beginning of the conflict, the government put out word that this was a foreign-inspired event. The people didn't buy it initially, some of them. They're like, oh, the government's just trying to set this up. But they very quickly saw that it was, and here's how they knew that it was. Remember I told you they brought in all these foreign fighters? Well, these communities in places like Syria are very tight-knit. Everybody knows everybody. And even by accent, by the type of Arabic that somebody's speaking, they're like, that guy's not from here. Where's that guy? That guy's from North Africa. They knew that these were foreigners. They're like, where did these people come from? How did they have these weapons? And then, look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out when you have guys that have anti-aircraft weapons, they have tanks, they have armored vehicles, they have tow missiles, anti-tank missiles. This is not a homegrown revolution, okay? This came from the outside. In fact, I talked about it the last time. The whole Benghazi operation where the diplomat and the CIA guys were killed, that was a gun running operation. That was the beginning of this. They were taking, after they overthrew Gaddafi, they were taking weapons from their arsenals and transshipping them through Benghazi to southern Turkey, to bases there, to arm these guys and send them down into Syria. That's how those guys got killed. It went wrong and they got killed. And that's why, in my view, Hillary Clinton never raised a finger to protect them, because as one person said, dead men don't tell tales, right? Shane?
Yeah, question. So I've been following this for several years now, and I remember before Trump showed up, I believe Israel's defense minister, Abigail Lieberman, he said that basically that they would rather have ISIS in power than the Syrian regime. That's about 3 years ago. Last year they said, in lieu of recent events, we have no real problems with the Syrian regime. We'd be willing to work with them. Do you see this as legitimate progress, or is this just more tomfoolery?
No, it's really more sleight of hand. What they want, and I think if you ask me, Israel's the engine that's driven all of this. They drove the invasion of Iraq. You know, their prime minister said, if you just take out Saddam Hussein, the region will be peaceful, you won't believe the changes. Then it was, if you just take out Libya, if you just take out Sudan, if you just take out. What's the common thread between every country we've targeted? They're all opponents of Israel, right? Now, here's the interesting thing about Israel, and I've had this discussion with people that are from Israel. I said, you know, you claim that you're threatened by Islamic terrorism and that you're the bulwark against Islamic terrorism in the region. Explain this to me. The war in Syria has been going on for 8 years. You have bombed the country, I think the estimate's at least 120 times in 8 years. Every attack has been on Syrian armed forces or their installations. Never been an attack against the terrorist group in Syria by Israel. Not only that, the terrorists that when they've been captured or they've been overrun, these warehouses, and you cannot believe the level of sophistication of this movement. There are underground tunnel systems built under the cities in Syria. I still don't know how they're able to do it, because you're talking about massive tunneling equipment. You're talking about something, I mean, on the scale of this or greater. Electrical lighting, ventilation, heating and cooling. You could drive a semi-truck through these tunnels. That's how big they are. And they go on for kilometers. I mean, tens of kilometers. Some of them are still being discovered. Anyway, when they do overrun these terrorists and they're able to capture weapons, it's very common for them to find weapons that came from Israel. Okay, now it's kind of out in the open. Again, the Israelis are kind of conceding grudgingly, well, yeah, we helped them, but they were treating them in their field hospitals. They would treat these injured terrorists and send them back into Syria to fight again. So, I mean, their role is very clear. They're clearly not an honest broker, and they clearly have a very specific target, and it's the government. But I think primarily, if they could have their way, what they'd like is for the country to be in constant conflict, constantly debilitated, and constantly weak. So if they could keep the fires burning, I don't know that they care that any side prevails as long as both sides are tearing each other apart. So, yes, Dennis.
In fact, John, there was more than one Israeli official that actually said that. Somebody might have been the former ambassador, Michael Horan, or whatever. I think he was the one that made that comment, but they just want to keep bleeding. I was just like, well, that's very human.
Well, they made a very major strategic error a couple months ago. You may remember this. There was a Russian plane that was shot down. 15 or 20 Russian servicemen on this plane killed. The function of the plane, it was an electronic surveillance plane. And the deal that the Russians had with the Israelis is, if you're thinking of launching an airstrike, we want advance notice. We want to know where it's coming from. Not so much because they're going to do anything to protect Syria, but they have a base there and they're going to protect their own people. The Israelis told them on that night they were going to attack from the east. They had targets that they considered Iranian targets in Syria. In fact, they came from the west, and what they did is they positioned their planes behind this Russian surveillance plane, And when the Syrian anti-aircraft systems were activated, the missile takes the biggest target and the first target, which was this surveillance plane, which is quite large. And it was actually a Syrian anti-aircraft system that shot this plane down. But the Russians were furious because they knew the Israelis set that up to happen by the way they positioned themselves and the fact that they lied that they weren't coming from the east, they were coming from the west. Brilliant tactical maneuver by the Israelis, in my opinion. Very brilliant. However, a major strategic blunder, because off of that, the Russians said, we're going to do three things from now on. Any aircraft trying to enter Syria from your areas are going to be electronically jammed. We are going to deploy the S-300 anti-aircraft system in Syria, which the Israelis have been begging them not to do. It's really interesting also to me that the Israelis will say, we're not worried about it, we can take it out. Well, why are you so upset? Then why are you trying to block it from being deployed if it's not a threat? And how is it, it's always interesting to me when it comes to political positions that a defensive system, an anti-aircraft system, is a threat to somebody else. It's only a threat if you're trying to attack that country, as far as I know, okay? So it really, and then there was a third thing that the Russians were doing, which is, they were deploying more forces and they were reinforcing the positions that they had in Syria, but they basically let the Israelis know that, that was the line that they should never have crossed. Look, the Russians are in Syria for Russians' purposes. They're not there for Syria's purposes, but they've been a tremendous aid not only in helping to defeat these terrorists, but they've provided tremendous humanitarian support in the country. The people love the Russians. They have a long history with the Russians, and people ask, well, why? Why the Russians and not us? Part of it is geographic. I don't think a lot of people realize, but Moscow to Damascus is like a 3-hour plane flight. That's how close those countries are. So it's naturally in that same region. They share the history of the Orthodox Church, both of them, and they have a long history together. Russians are very invested commercially in Syria. They have bases there. They have a naval base there. They have an air base there now. But they've provided help on a lot of different levels. They've helped to demine areas for the Syrians. They've helped with reconstruction. So it's not just military assistance. But in the end, the Russians want to see a political resolution to the conflict. They're going to do everything they can to make it happen. And I think they're making the most headway, and they've got the attention of most of the parties. The effect has been to marginalize the United States. The United States is kind of on the outside looking in now. And the European Union now, as they are in Iran, they're starting to question this policy of just following whatever America tells them to do in Syria, because now they see they're going to be on the outs too. The campaign didn't work. The Syrian government's still there. It's more popular than ever before. They're rebuilding the country without us. We're not going to get in on the contracts. I mean, everything's going the wrong way for them because they decided to do whatever we told them to do. So on Iran, you may have read in the news, Trump is very resolute, as Dennis pointed out, about, we're going to, John Bolton would go to war with Iran tomorrow. I mean, Trump is like, we're going to up the sanctions, we're going to up them more, we're going to up them more, and we're going to sanction the Russians. And, I don't know where that's all going to end, other than they're going to find a way around sanctions, and they're going to develop a system that, in my opinion, is going to hurt us really bad somehow. They say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So these countries aren't stupid. They're going to get together and they're going to figure out a way around it. And we're going to be on the outside looking in on that too, in my opinion. But with Iran, I forgot where I was going with that. I started somewhere and now I can't remember. I wanted to talk about Iran. Oh well, it'll come back to me. But all these parties that, like somebody said, yeah, but Syria's enlisted Iran to come in and help them. They've enlisted the Russians to come in and help them. What do you expect them to do? Look at the parties that have been arrayed against them for 8 years. Just us by ourselves is enough, right? Britain, France, interestingly, the same two colonial powers that carved up Syria in the early 1900s after World War I. Now they're back to do it again. Some of the European Union countries have contributed in different ways. The Turks are involved up to their necks. The Saudis, the Gulf states, the Israelis. what do you think this country is going to do? They're not going to sit there and not work with countries that are willing to work with them and help them. Any country's going to take on alliances to try to counter the threat. So they don't have any interest in having the Russians take over Syria, and the Russians don't have any interest in being there any longer than they have to be there. They've lost a lot of people in this too. It's not widely publicized, but they've had a lot of losses in this. And they don't want to be in another Afghanistan. They learned their lesson there. They don't want to be doing that. So they're trying their best to bring the parties together, structure a political settlement, and put this thing to bed. Because the military campaign is essentially over, and everybody acknowledges that it's over and that the West lost. Now it's how do you put the country back together? The people want one country. They don't want it divided up. They are very opposed to the idea of a Kurdish state in the north of Syria. However, the Syrian government has talked to the Kurds, and it's not new, they've been talking to them for decades about some type of limited autonomy in the north where they can run their own affairs, but they're still part of the country. And frankly, the Kurds in Syria, as opposed to those in Turkey or maybe in Iraq, they don't want to be separated from Syria. They do want to remain part of Syria, but they want this Kurdish area, and the government's trying to work it out with them. So, but with that exception, the people in Syria consider themselves Syrians. They want to remain one country. They don't want their country divided. They have a very long history of survival. The country's 7,000 years old. It didn't get there by folding, and they don't fold. So that's what we found out the hard way, is they were a lot harder nut to crack than we thought. In fact, this is an interesting anecdotal story, but it was one of the nights when, I don't think it was the night we were launching cruise missiles. I think it was when the Israelis were one of their attacks. And I was online with a friend of mine in Syria up on the coast in Latakia. And I said, man, that's near you. He goes, yeah, I know exactly where that building is. And I said, well, you better get your family down and get cover. And he goes, no, we're going up on the roof to watch. And a few minutes later, I got pictures. They're sitting up on a roof watching like a fireworks show. He goes, yeah, no, we're not worried about it. We're not worried about it. They're very adaptable people. They can deal with hardship very well, and they have dealt with it very well. But it's just unfortunate. The biggest problem, frankly, post-war for the Syrians is you've had 8 years in which these Islamic fundamentalist groups have occupied areas of the country and have indoctrinated an entire generation of kids in that type of thinking. So now it's re-educating these kids and trying to save kids that were in some of these areas that grew up for 8 years, 10 years, being fed this line of insanity, right? So they've got challenges in front of them, but the progress is good. The progress is better every time I talk to them. You've got water systems being restored, electrical, hydro, power, fuel, all that stuff's coming back online, and people they're very optimistic about now that the fighting's over, they're going to rebuild and they'll be okay in the long run. They still have to resolve our presence, and we don't know where that's going to go. John.
Yeah, when you take a country like that and leave it in mass chaos for this long, what tends to happen is the people with high IQs leave. And so what you're left with is people that have a much harder time putting that society back together again. A couple of my doctors are both from Syria, and they told me before this all started, the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims all got together just great. Mm-hmm. And then the CIA came in and did whatever they're doing. I mean, we are becoming the evil empire. There's no doubt about it.
It's very malicious. The people in Syria don't understand it. They're like, well, what did we do? I mean, we didn't attack you. We didn't threaten to attack you. What is this about? Why are you doing? They were very puzzled by where this was coming from. And when I tried to explain to them the dynamics of domestic politics and the lack of control we have over our executive branch.
So when you drain a society of high IQ people, it becomes easier to drain that society of its natural resources.
Well, that's true, but I will tell you this. Syrians have very strong connections any culture that's that ancient and that survived that long. And believe me, we're not the first ones that came through Syria and wreaked havoc. I mean, they had the Mongols, they had the Ottoman Empire, they had the Romans, I always tell people who fret about the American presence there, I said, look around the country. It's dotted with the ruins of all these empires that came, and they thought they were all staying forever too, and they were going to rule the country. And now these are tourist sites, right? There's a reason, because they're not going to outlet. I think it's the most foolish approach, and I'm not just talking about Syria, but this idea of you're going to have an empire and a foreign empire. I analogize it to like riding a bull. You know the guys in the rodeo that try to stay on the bull as long as they can? Eventually they're coming off the bull. They're not staying on there forever. And that's what it's like when you try to occupy another country. Why? Because those people aren't going away. That's their country. How long are you going to stay? You're not going to stay indefinitely. You can't, right? Why do you go in the first place? I don't know. You know, it's crazy, but I think we have to get a handle on this as Americans, because it impacts, and we're paying for this through taxes. We're paying for it so many ways, right? We're alienating a whole group of people that now have, a negative view about our country. And that means your ability to influence them, not at the end of a gun, but through reason and example and logic, and admiration. That's how we should be changing people around the world. Well, now who's going to listen to you? Like John said, I mean, you're this marauding, you're like the proverbial bull in a china shop now on the globe, And every place you leave is worse than when you came there. None of them you can look at and say, well, but look, it's way better. No, it's not. I will say this. The people in Syria they're very astute. They're not ignorant people. And they also understand this distinction between our government and the people. They love the American people. They know what America stands for. They don't look at Americans like, oh, we hate Americans. They love the American people, but they detest the American government. And I tell them, well, we share that in common. I don't know what to tell you. So anyway, Dennis?
And Jenny, you touched on this earlier, but, when you're out there, you're talking about the political stuff or reading about that, but the influences, and people talk about election collusion, there was this fake Russiagate scandal, which they're still trying to promote. But could you tell us a little bit about the degree to which some of the foreign special interests that are wreaking havoc in Syria and utilizing the U.S. government and U.S. military to do it, just how deeply embedded they are and how much they're doing through financial and other means and using media to accomplish their goals?
Well, I mean, the amount of money the Saudis spend, not just in the United States on politicians, but in Britain, France, throughout Europe. I mean, you see these countries taking policies that are obviously at complete odds with what's in the best interest of their own citizens. And the question is, why? Why are they doing that? Why would they do that? Because unfortunately, those politicians have been disconnected from their constituents, and they're answering to people who line their pockets. And when I say they line their pockets, it's not always a check, it's not always cash, but they'll tell a guy who's on what's a committee, that military committee that we would have in Congress? What's one of the main ones? Anyway, somebody who sits on a committee that deals with military and defense. When you're done serving, we've got a consulting job for you with us. We'll pay you $500,000 a year. It's a pretty strong inducement to go their way, isn't it? Their constituents can't offer them that. They can't offer them squat compared to that. And so they're going to have prestige, they're going to have money, they feel valued. Oh, these guys think I'm brilliant. No, they don't. You're just a stooge. They're just buying you, But they're corruptible, and they're corrupted, because they're corruptible. So yeah, you have countries like Turkey spends a lot of money. They hire lobbying groups here in this country. The Saudis have multiple lobbying groups here in this country that they fund. They don't have Islamic names. You would never know the Saudis are behind them. And they fund this type of stuff for a reason. When they want you, they tell you, we need your army over here to do this, and we do it. Look at how the Saudis receive this exceptional treatment. If you don't think it traces back to dollars, here's Trump. He takes this travel ban, right, to protect us against immigration from these Islamic countries. What country's not on that list? Saudi Arabia. Where did 19 of the 21 hijackers come from? Saudi Arabia. Who funds every fundamentalist mosque everywhere in the world? Saudi Arabia. I mean, but they're not on the list. How would that happen? I mean, think about it. Because Trump just forgot Saudi Arabia? No. They killed this, Saudi journalist who, frankly, I don't have a lot of sympathy for the guy because he was in bed with this royal family for years, and that's how his lifestyle was financed, and that's how he got to where he was. You lay down with dogs, you wake up with fleas, is the expression, right? So it's unfortunate for his family that he met that end, but I have little sympathy for him. But the point is, he was an American. There's all this hoopla about his death, and what did Trump say? Well, we're not giving up these contracts with Saudi Arabia. If we do that, then the Chinese are going to sell him stuff. The guy becomes irrelevant in the equation, right? That's the kind of money you're talking about. It buys a lot of loyalty and a lot of influence. And that's part of what we're up against. Yeah. Not just on Syria, I mean, in general, right?
Look at Yemen, what's happening there.
Oh, it's horrible. If you think Syria is bad, Yemen is like 10 times worse than Syria. There is literally a genocide going on there. I think I read the other day, they've got a child dies every 10 minutes in that country. Every 10 minutes. You don't even hear the word Yemen on the news. Ever.
And the fact that they made 1,000 times more of a beef about that dead ISIS journalist than over the side of Yemen shows how fake news.
Yeah, you're right. That's a great point. Here's all this 24/7 news cycle about Khashoggi and how did he die. And, the Saudis, oh my God. I told a guy in Syria, I said, they're an embarrassment to the Arabs. And he goes, I have to disagree with you. He goes, they're an embarrassment to the human race and to the Martians on Mars. He said, and my tailor is from Syria. We were talking about it the other day, and he goes, okay, they wanted to kill the guy. He's in Turkey. You send 15 guys and a pathologist over to do this? How about you just pay somebody $200 to make it look like a robbery on the street? He shoots him and he kills them. No, that's not how they do things, right? And then it's not enough that they kill you. They've got to cut you into pieces. They've got to drop you into acid. I hate to break this to you, but he's not suffering because you already killed him, okay? So you can do whatever you want to the body. They are unbelievable. I mean, they're so medieval, it is incredible, okay? But
Bad, you offended everyone.
yeah. Well, and then let's talk about the left. Here's another example of American politics. I don't hear the women's movement or the left protesting Saudi Arabia. Women have no rights there, right? You can't construct a church or practice Christianity in the country. You can't drink alcohol. All these medieval type prohibitions that you would think are completely counter to leftist progressive thinking. I mean, Trump, he's terrible when it comes to women's rights. What about that? They never open their mouth about it, right? I always find that really interesting. I don't know if they've corrupted the women's movement here too, but I don't think so.
The petrodollar wouldn't exist without Saudi Arabia.
No.
And Saudi Arabia owns a huge part of Fox News.
Oh, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. They have so much influence on this country, and that's what I keep coming back to is this country. Because if this country was operating the way the founders wanted it to operate, we would have so many friends in the world, and we would avoid those friends that we have that we shouldn't have, right? And we would have good relations and trade with all these countries. We would need an army as big as the one we have. So I think in the end, the answer to what's going on in Syria is a part of a bigger question, which is we've got to regain control of our government in our country before it puts us in further jeopardy, as Americans. Yeah, Kathy.
And as Christianity goes, I mean, being anti-abortion, and yet we're over there killing people like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
It is insane.
It is.
I mean, the insanity is unbelievable. What is the difference? Taking a life. There's none.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to even get into some of the horrors that war's brought to that country. And like I said, you've got a whole younger generation that's grown up with that now, and you've got a country that's traumatized socially by what's happened. Something John mentioned that a lot of people don't know is that in Syria, I mean, you have all these groups prior to this coexisted very well for centuries, actually. There's Jews in Syria, Christians, Muslims, and other groups as well. And they all lived very well in Syria, and they never had any problems. But when you want to tear a country apart, what's one of the first things you do? What do they do to us? It's pit one group against another group, right? That's how government operates. So, yes, sir?
Given all this, quickly, what's the remedy for foreign policy for someone like Trump?
Well, I think that's a great question. Had he simply followed through on what he campaigned on? If you remember when he campaigned, and a lot of people will tell you it was the difference in him getting elected, is his promise to disengage from these pointless foreign conflicts, focus on America, not the politics of these other countries. If they're a legitimate threat to our national security, he has a duty to respond. That's his job. But where you're just trying to change politics in another country because you don't like the leaders, no. That country gets to determine who their leader is. You don't determine who their leader is. Here we are, right? We're yelling about Russian interference in our election, and we're sending our military to overturn governments in other countries. But so I think the answer is what Trump identified during his campaign. Where did it take a left turn? I don't know, but I'll tell you something really interesting, and you can look this up online. There was an interview with an NBC journalist during the presidential campaign at the point that it was Hillary versus Trump. I mean, the candidates had been chosen by each party. And this journalist was asking Assad in an interview in Syria, who do you prefer? And he said, you know what, we really don't follow the politics in America because we don't have any control over it, so we really don't follow it. And he says, well, one of the questions they asked him, the journalist betraying his own political orientation, he says, well, Donald Trump has no foreign policy experience. Do you think that's dangerous? And the Syrian president looked at me and he laughed. He goes, who had it before him? Obama? Bush? Clinton? None of them had it, right? He goes, that's part of the problem with your country. You've got these people determining these policies. They don't even know anything about the rest of the world. So then they said, well, Donald Trump said he wants to focus more on ISIS and the United States and get out of Syria, so that you must like Donald Trump. And he said, I don't know anything about Donald Trump. And I don't go by what American politicians say during their campaigns because it's just rhetoric. Isn't that interesting? He said, we wait till they're in office because it always changes once they get in. And that's exactly what happened. And you know what? It's not just Trump. Think back. What did Bush Jr. campaign on?
Humble foreign policy.
Humble foreign policy, no more nation building, right? Everybody embraced it. Thank God. We're done with these stupid wars. He's going to bring us home. What did he do? Boom, expanded it. What did Obama campaign on? I'm getting us out of Afghanistan. I'm getting us out of these countries. Everybody, oh, great. He gets in. He expanded it. It just keeps going. It's unbelievable, right? So in answer to your question, I think we got to get back to focusing on us and establishing healthy relationships with these countries. They're not built on intimidation and you're going to do what we say or else. We have a lot to offer. I mean, without a gun, right? And that's where we should be focused, and that's what Washington preached, right?
Jefferson.
And all the founders.
And Ron Paul.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And Dennis. You don't need any greater authority than this guy right here.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else? Okay.
Great job, John.
Thank you.